Welcome, everyone, to the History of Social Change podcast, sponsored by Sea Change Magazine and the Government of Canada. Today, we're commemorating the 75th anniversary of Viola Desmond challenging racial discrimination with a conversation that we are calling Looking Back, Looking Forward. We're delighted to have a fantastic group of panelists with us today. Social change advocates, educators, activists, storytellers, change makers. Let's start with some bios. First, we have Jean Augustine. After working in the field of education, the Honorable Jean Augustine became the first African-Canadian woman to be elected to the Parliament of Canada. She would win 4 consecutive elections until leaving politics in 2006. While in office, she had various positions and served as for example, the Minister of State for Multiculturalism and the Status of Women. She was also the Parliamentary Secretary to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, among other roles, which she can tell us more about if she'd like. Among her many accomplishments as an MP, Jean played a pivotal role in championing legislation to recognize February as Black History Month in Canada. Her many accolades include receiving the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, being appointed as a member of the Order of Canada, Commander of the Order of the British Empire, and the Order of Ontario. Historian, author, speaker, and consultant on Black history, anti-racism, and women's issues, Rosemary Sadlier is the past president of the Ontario Black History Society. In that unpaid role, which she held for 22 years, Rosemary was instrumental in securing the commemoration of Black History Month at all levels of government. She also successfully fought for the recognition of Emancipation Day, municipally, provincially, and most recently, nationally. She has researched and written extensively about Black history and Black Canadian history, and her publications include Harriet Tubman and the Kids' Book of Black Canadian History. Among many honors, she was awarded the Order of Ontario in 2009. Rebecca Darwent co-founded the Foundation for Black Communities in 2020, an organization committed to ensuring every Black person in Canada can flourish. She was Director of Global Partnerships at Singularity University, leading tech and education programming across 5 continents. Rebecca also worked in the Ontario provincial government as a senior policy advisor to the Minister of Children and Youth Services, responsible for the Anti-Racism Directorate. She is vice president of Laidlaw Foundation, a Women's Leaders for the World Fellow, and a Canadian Millennium Laureate. These are tough words. Anyway, I'm so excited to have all of you here. And I just wanted to give a very quick shout out to the History of Social Change and the reason we're here. We basically started the History of Social Change because we believe that social change is an important lens from which to examine Canada's unique history. We also feel it's incredibly important to understand and know our past, every single side of it, whether the good, bad, and ugly, as well as to acknowledge our roles in all of it. Because in order to create a future that we're proud of, we have to be able to look back and understand where we come from. With that in mind, let's get started. Because we're, the context is Viola Desmond, why don't we start with her? What does Viola Desmond, when you hear her name, what does she and her story represent to you? I'm going to throw this question to each one of you if you want to respond. Anyone? Jean, would you like to start with that question?
Well, Viola Desmond, once the name comes up, it conjures a sense of history, a sense of place, and to a certain extent, resistance to racism and racist acts and actions. I think Viola stood up, that she ensured that she knew her place in the society. She knew what had happened because that theater and the instance in that theater was not the very first instance. We know that Carrie Best suffered the same issue in terms of having her or telling her that this was not a place where she should be. And so it was really the self-assurance, the fact that she was a proud Black woman and that she was not going to allow herself to be diminished by racist actions.
Well said. Very, very well said. Rosemary, what would you say to that when you
Well,
hear the name?
I agree with everything that Jean just said. I mean, that is the story of Viola Desmond. When I first became aware of her story, it was because I was doing research on my first book that I did on Black women. And I had the opportunity to interview Viola Desmond's husband. And I also was able to meet Carrie Best. And for me, finding out that story was incredibly powerful because I had already started going into schools on behalf of the organization I represented, giving presentations, and I would often come in on the heels of hearing about Rosa Parks. And even though my own, my lived experience told me there were things that happened in Canada, we didn't always talk about what we did. And there's so many reasons for that. But let me just say that when I talked to Carrie Best in particular, and she laid out the groundwork of what had happened for other people, including herself. And in a particular sense, Viola was a test case, pushing the boundaries. Mm-hmm. I think that there's two ways of looking at her story, that she went into it knowingly or she went into it innocently, but she certainly did not plan for her car to need to be repaired. And I don't think she was necessarily planning on going to the theater. But once there, she knew what was going to happen. And she may well have known what it meant not to pay for a main floor seat. And she may well have been prepared to face those consequences, although she paid dearly for them. And I think that's, in addition to the resistance and the courage, and, given some of the insight that I got from her husband, she paid dearly for that. And I think that that's another reminder that when people are putting forward an opinion that's not well accepted in society yet, they pay in some way for that. And so it's an aspect of courage, but it's a way of framing courage that we don't often focus on.
Again, well said. Thank you so much for that, for sharing that. Rebecca, as the younger woman on this panel, younger generation, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on when you hear her name. And we'll get to the second question next, which is, when did you hear about Viola Desmond? So we'll get to that next.
Thank you. I am drawing from my fellow panelists. The first word that comes to mind when I hear Viola Desmond's name is courage. And courage is what her entire story represents to me, recognizing that she had the courage to go up against the status quo. And as Rosemary spoke about the consequences of that, it takes a lot to stand up in the face of knowing what is wrong, feeling the injustice, and yet making a decision, conscious or otherwise, to take a stand. Really means a lot. And I see her story as inspiration to know that it's possible, regardless of the context or whatever year you're in. There is always movement and always possibility in the moment that you find yourself in.
Beautiful. And now I'd be really curious to know when you learned about Viola Desmond. I'm going to bring that to you first, just because I'm curious about the younger generations, and to bring with that, the second part of the question, which is, do you believe most students know her name? And are we teaching them the type of history, Canadian history, that we should be teaching them, which would include Viola Desmond and other individuals, like Black Canadians or other Indigenous Canadians, that perhaps we do not see being taught properly in our system?
I heard about Viola Desmond for the first time when her story was coming to being on the Canadian $10 bill. So I had not heard about her story before that. I believe I read about it in a CBC article, and it sparked a tremendous conversation in my family, because I have been raised by Black women who are very, very proud of our history. And it was a glaring gap the Black Canadian reality is a gap that I think exists in many families across Canada. And it's important to recognize that it's happening in Black families as well. And so I did not hear her story in school at all. I was not surrounded by that knowledge. And I can say with certainty that we are not teaching kids and students enough about Black history, specifically Black Canadian history. And it is, despite the trailblazing efforts of the women that I am honored to be with on this panel, there is a long way to go.
Mhm.
What about you, Gina and Rosemary? Did you know about Viola early on? Like Rosemary, you said you were researching for, you had already done, you were doing some research for a book as well, but I guess your knowledge of her came earlier, right? You know, tell me when that came about, and was it at the time, or what was?
Well, for me, I was doing the research on that for that particular book about 1992, 1993. So that was when I came to know her story for the first time, and it blew me away. And I made a point of including it. I made a point of, I'm always going to privilege Black women because we are the most unknown element of African Canadian history. If people know any history, it's going to be about African Canadian men. So I made a point of including her story for sure. Every time I did a Black history presentation, carrying on the mandate of the organization that I represented, I did thousands, literally, of Black history presentations in schools. And I felt it was critical to provide that counter to the Rosa Parks story, with all respect to Rosa Parks, but also to encourage students to question certain things. And the other side of the Viola Desmond story, if I can just say, it happens to coincide. I found out that the $10 bill was going to be issued, and I was at a public event, and I was beyond excited. I could barely talk about what I was there to talk about, because for me, this was so incredibly perfect. She was charged with defrauding the government of a certain amount of money, and now she was going to be featured on the $10 bill. It was perfect.
It's wonderful. No, you're right. Perfect. That would be a great way to sort of sum that up. And what about you, Jean? Well, when did you hear about her? When did her name become so, prominent?
I think, Elisa, I am going back to the late 1970s into the early 80s, when we started the National Black Coalition of Canada. And we went around the country finding African Canadians who were great participants in the society. When we were engaged with discussions around the multicultural nature of Canada and the voices that needed to be there. And I met a whole series of individuals from across the country, including in the province of Nova Scotia and in Halifax in particular. And and I can drop, names of people who were shakers and movers at the time, but Carrie Best was one that I got to know well, got to know about her newspaper writing, got to know about Africville and the struggles around Africville and the challenges. She was constantly in the court system, appealing this and putting in motions around whatever. And so I got kind of engaged with her in those stories and finding out. Actually, I went to her funeral in New Glasgow when she passed away. I was just so saw her as a mentor and as a role model and as a feisty, as my kids would say, old woman, even at the age she was at the time. That feistiness was there, that call for justice, social justice, making this place a fairer, more just place for everybody, including African Canadians and Indigenous peoples. And so I heard from her struggle with that theater, it was one of the things that she related, and the name Viola Desmond came up as, and the fact that she challenged, or she was the one that stood behind and made sure that that case was well known, and she propagated through her paper that information and helped to find counsel and others to support. So that was when I heard about Viola Desmond, from Carrie Best and from all the social activists from Africville situation and from Nova Scotia. And at the same time, like Rosemary, I was so elated when her name was the one that was chosen, because knowing her story and the coming later around Black history and what we need to do about Black Canadian history and how we teach Black Canadian history, and who are the folks in Black Canadian history that we need to ensure that our young people learn about and know about. And so when I walk into a room and you see Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, whatever, I say, we have Oscar Peterson, we have Viola. This is Black History Month in Canada.
Right, right.
And so again, her story and the fact that she is on our $10 bill, that our young people that would know of her and know of her story and know of this injustice that, and it didn't stop there. It wasn't that this was it. It was interesting. And I'll give you the side story that there was a young person who wrote to the premier of the province, who calculated what she paid back then and what the value of that money is today. It was something like $343 and change. And he asked the premier to pay that back to her family and to her estate. And my understanding is the premier, they did agree, and they did round it off to $500 and paid it to her sister, paid it to her family. But again, young people understand that story. Young people know that story. And it's important that in light of telling Viola's story, we need to have Black Canadians understand that in Canada, we have the heroes, the heroines, the doers, the shakers, the movers, the militants, the whatever that there is in American society. And we have to find those people, and we have to make sure that we amplify their message and that we put their situation forward for the next generation.
Thank you. That's absolutely. I'm actually going to segue to another question I was going to ask later on, because we keep bringing up the fact that we know the American stories, Rosa Parks, and it keeps coming up. It seems to me that the Canadian students, and even the Canadian public, we are all much more aware of, the Black African Americans as opposed to those in our own country. So, and even now, I think about the George Floyd story, how that brought up, certain in America, it seemed to really trigger conversations around racial equity and social justice. I'm wondering if we, do we actually gain from the American stories in some way in terms of our own progress, and or do we really, and I think I know the answer to this part, but we need to make more of an emphasis on learning the, Black Canadians. How do we do that? But I do want to talk about the importance of what can we learn from other countries, and how do we bring the stories of Canadians to the forefront?
I think, the overarching question is there sufficient Black Canadian history taught? And clearly the answer to that is no, there is not. And there is not Black Canadian history taught in part because, one, there's no overarching recognition that Black people of African origin have been in this country for any period of time. And so the narrative of the recent arrival is an accurate but an inaccurate reflection of the African Canadian community. And it allows some people to feel that Black history began in 1967, and so therefore there's no reason to consider anything else, and feel comfort in not knowing and not doing and not researching. I think the other side of that is that there's another group who look to the United States as the cultural leaders and the cultural influencers, not just for Canada, but for the world. And anything that happens there will ultimately have impact and implication for others. But I think that we have to go back further, and we have to look at the reality of the transatlantic slave trade. We have to look at what that particular phenomenon that robbed Africa of so many people, that denied so many people of their language, culture, ways of knowing over generations, and planted them in the West, whether that was the Caribbean or the United States or Canada. That is the reality that we also have to look at. So we define ourselves as a bilingual, bicultural country that's multicultural. I mean, there's different iterations. I think that we have to add to that the reality that at least for one person, we have a name and we have a beginning. And that man happened to be free, and his name was Matthew da Costa, and he arrived here in 1604-ish. But there were Africans in Canada, the land we now call Canada, prior to that. Africans who were enslaved, Africans who were free, Africans who were helping with the Courrier du Bois, Africans who were founding cities. And because the borders are incredibly loose and not firmed up until really 1867, it makes it so much more challenging for people to want to give consideration to what happened before 1867. There were Black people here, there were First Nations people here, there were Europeans here. And without that recognition and acceptance and inclusion in how we frame and tell our stories, automatically Black Canadian history does not get told. And there's just one other piece here in terms of the overarching, in terms of the practical. In Ontario, how do educational resources, how are they purchased? How are they determined? And how are they disseminated? We don't have a central place that buys up or disseminates materials to schools. So what happens is that each individual school has their own budget, and they will then, from that budget, small budget, make their purchases. The materials that come in overwhelmingly from the United States are less expensive, more numerous, and they flood the market. So it will be common to find books that reflect Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks compared to the books that might be there to reflect Viola Desmond, for example.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. Anyone else want to add? Yes, Jean.
It's interesting that I was reading about Lee Miracle, who just passed away. And when she wrote about, Indigenous people or tried to tell their stories, there were, those book publishers who said, I don't think there would be an interest in the society, or interest in the sale, or people who would be there to buy your books. And she had to do a petition and get X number of names of people who said yes, they would buy her books. So again, it's who's doing the writing, who has the whatever to do the research, because part of the problem that we had then, and some things that we see now, which shows the direction and change, is the idea that we now have people in academia, professors and researchers and people who were putting together desegregated kind of information, who were pulling out. And your program and others, fleshing and pulling out and putting through sieves that information so we now can have it. There is an old saying, an old African saying, if lions had their own, had their own, the tale of the, had their own historians, the tale of the hunt will be completely different.
Right.
And so who is telling the story?
Yeah.
Who are researching the story? Who are ensuring that the stories are out there to be bought, to be disseminated, to be sold, to be part of the education system, etc. I taught social studies for years and years. And all the modules that came from the Ministry of Education, Rebecca, didn't have anything in it about Indigenous people, about treaties, about any of that stuff. Had nothing, if there was anything at all, it was along the margin and along the, the footnotes. The Underground Railroad was more or less the only reference in schools. But we know now people are digging up that history, like Rosemary, they're writing the books for children, for adults, for academia. And so we find that we have now to put the emphasis on African, Canadian. We have to decolonize, as it were, the education and the education system,
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that we are in that period where these difficult conversations or these comfortable conversations that we're having, that's being had in the society, those things are going to help us to move forward. And I think our young people, Rebecca, I'm sure you would agree, our young people want to know. They want to be affirmed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the reality is we live in a global society. We have the Canadian context, and it echoes the same stories. Similar stories are happening across the globe. Anti-Black racism is real in every single country of this world, regardless of where you are, even on the continent. And so the nuanced element of the Black reality is really important, particularly in a Canadian context. The Black history in Nova Scotia looks different than Black history in Alberta, where I grew up. Black pioneers as an entire history that is so rarely told. And I think that the nuance is what people are hungry for, to really know the details. And so much is not documented. So I'm excited about that. And I think the next generation is really excited about that.
I think it's important also to underline the fact that we have the United Nations understanding exactly what you said, Rebecca. This is why they declared a decade for people of African descent, because no matter where we are in whatever part of the world, that our situation is the same around racism, around justice system, around socioeconomic conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And so the decade for people of African descent, which ends, I think, in 2025, 24, 25, should see great improvement in our knowledge base, in our education system, in our textbooks and research and all that information that would create this inclusive society that we know all talking about.
Okay. And Rosemary, it seems like you wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, I was trying to find the right way to frame it, but I think it comes down to representation in a very broad sense. And I think that because Black history was so denied in being possible, being something that was there, that it really was a disincentive for highly motivated people to get into history or any related field where they could begin to do certain work at a particular level. I can think of one person early on. I mean, didn't get into, there was no Black history taught in school, in public school, nor in university. You had to ferret out courses if you were motivated that might almost speak to what you were interested in. Black history didn't exist in university either. I can think of one person who was connected to Parks Canada. His name was Owen Thomas. He wanted to do a doctorate in Black Canadian history. And without getting into all the gory details, he was told he could not do so because there wasn't sufficient material to warrant his study. No one would take him on and nobody could be his advisor. And I think it was a real, a further disincentive for him to continue along that path. So it's a combination of the materials not being there, but also the pressures that cause those materials not to be created in the first place,
Right.
which is, it's not all about internalized racism. It's about systemic racism.
Yes, a very, very good point. And which brings me to Black History Month, which it seems, it's 25 years since Black History Month was first celebrated in Canada, because we're talking about in educating the public, educating our students. This is such an important commemoration. And I know both you and Jean and Rosemary were involved in that. What did it mean to you? I mean, I know we could probably go on for a long time about what that meant to you, but I mean, within this context, of educating, of getting people to learn more about a history that was, we just didn't acknowledge. And so what did that victory mean to either one of you? Who wants to go first? Anyone?
Well, what I can say to this is that I was incredibly, incredibly moved and grateful for what ultimately happened through Jean's efforts in Ottawa to make this national declaration across this country. But it began long before that. And as much as we're grateful for what Jean did, it began in Canada with the Canadian Negro Women's Association, having an informal celebration building on what they learned about from the Porters, and Carter G. Woodson's initiative in the United States. So there were informal celebrations within the Black community in the 1950s that they put on, and at least one was held at what had been the British Methodist Episcopal Church on Shaw Street, hosted by the person who later became Citizenship Court Judge Stanley G. Grizel. But it was a small thing and informal and within pretty much the Black community. And it wasn't until the formation of the Ontario Black History Society that Dr. Daniel G. Hill, Wilson O. Brooks, Lorraine Hubbard, Joan Kazmarski, and I'm probably leaving somebody else out. But those people got together and in 1978 created the organization. By 1979, effected the first Black History Month in the city of Toronto.
Right.
However, by the time I became the president of this organization, what we discovered by accident is that the proclamation that they had was something that had to be requested on an annual basis, and we didn't know that. So we had to go to the city to secure it, and it was literally at the 11th hour. But that was really frightening to find out that we might not have had a formal celebration of Black History Month, because the whole point was to raise awareness and get people involved and engaged, and to, if nothing else, at least bring some time and attention to learning and considering what Black history might be. So I then went to the province of Ontario and was able to secure a proclamation of sorts. I went to every province and also did that, approached federal representatives, including Jean, and it was Jean, thankfully, who took it on. And that ultimately resulted in the December 1995 passage of the Declaration, and the first celebration in February 1996, the first national celebration. It was amazing.
It really was amazing. But Elisa, that goes into what we were talking about earlier, and that is we mimicked a lot of the things that were happening in the US, the civil rights movement, the whatever was happening there as Black Canadians, we mimicked that. We tried to do as much as we can to influence Canadian society using the patterns, using the modus operandi of the activists in the US, using whatever, because we did not have all the leverages that we ought to have had in Canadian society.
Right.
And so at the time when we were denied, or Rosemary's letter was denied by the minister, two answers came out, which were very offensive at the time. One was, we don't know what that was about. It is an American Black History Month is a kind of American thing. And secondly, as a federal government, we don't do proclamation, and they should know that we don't do proclamations. And so those two things, once they were expressed to me, they were really the kind of thing that spurred me on. So we don't do proclamation, we don't do, but what can we do? What can we do? And I went after everybody who had some decision-making powers, and I was told two things. You can do, if you feel very strongly about this, you can do a private member's bill, or you can go for a unanimous consent from all parties in the House. At that time, remember, we were talking about 1994, 1995. We had, for the very first time in the Parliament of Canada, the Reform Party, right? We had, for the very first time, the Bloc Québécois. And of course, the NDP and the Liberals, of course. So it meant we had, at the time, 308 members in the House. The discussion at the time was around trade issues, was around NAFTA, was around softwood lumber, yogurt and ice cream, boneless beef. And the other day I jokingly said, I knocked at thousands and thousands of doors in Etobicoke Lakeshore, and at no door did somebody say to me, when you get to Ottawa, make sure you vote for boneless beef. But those were the discussions at the time. There were trade issues, there were issues that some of it keeps cropping up now again. And so here was Augustine coming along talking about Black folks, social, what's going on in the education system, and asking people to pattern and to follow February as Black History Month in Canada, etc. So it was not easy going. And there were very many, what I call them agents provocateurs, people who were ready to throw you off your game. So when I went to ask, they would say, so you want February? Who is going to come for March? Black History Month? When are we going to have White History Month? You know, those just to throw you. And remember now, we did not have what we have today, Elisa. You could have sent emails out to everybody, or you can send Instagram or whatever else to everybody. It had to be talking to people one-on-one, convincing them, convincing their staff, the people who put things in front of them, killing any number of trees so that I could have the motion wherever I met somebody in the elevator to tell them, this is what I'm putting. I need you to I need you to support this. And then finding seconders for the motion, because you have to have a seconder. You don't know who's going to be in the House at the particular point in time. So everybody has to know what it is you will be standing up to ask, because you're looking for unanimous consent. And I wanted to tell the whole story of Black folks and what happened in Canada. And I was told, if you want unanimous consent, if you want a motion that is not debatable, you have to go straight for the facts. nothing that could be debatable. And so the motion is a very, very simple one, that we were here, we have been part of the settlement, we've been part of the building, we've been part of the whatever of this country. We are a diverse Black Canadian population coming from different and various ways. And we have been making our contribution. Therefore, I'm asking everybody to support this, this motion for Black History Month in Canada. And then I had to do all of the explanation afterwards to the community, because there were people who said, so Mrs. Augustine, you gave us the shortest month of the year and the coldest month of the year. And you know, the idea was we were already, as Rosemary said, influenced by what was happening in the South, celebrating. It didn't make sense going for another month or another whatever.
Right.
And but it was a joyful time for us. And when we've celebrated, as you notice, the 25th anniversary, Black History Month is just discussed everywhere in Canadian society, in churches, in schools, in whatever. It has given a focus for activities and for the study of and you know, different people now want to call it different things. You hear someone not wanting to say Black history, oh, it's heritage.
Right.
They put all kinds of things, but I think what we have in the legislative process is Black History Month.
Indeed, indeed.
I was just going to interject, so sorry, Rebecca. The idea of the American influence and the Canadian influence, there's one more piece to that that I think, I'm sure people realize, but just to clarify, at that point in time, you know, until relatively recently, the majority population had a historic connection to the United States. A majority African Canadian community had some kind of connection. They were descendants of the Underground Railroad arrivals through the Black Loyalist migrations. So that even though we're a separate country, there was still a connection, a continuation almost. And I think that now the population has shifted again in terms of the African Canadian population, where people are from the Caribbean or Africa, much more so than they might have a background connecting them to the American situation. So it's just one more piece to that whole discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
Plus the fact we were not in the media, we were not anywhere.
Right.
We had to struggle to get the CBC to hire a Black person to read the news, or to have, you know, to have mentors out there that we can point to. So again, like the Lions, we weren't able to tell our story because we didn't have our own storytellers and historians. Rebecca.
If I may just extend a tremendous amount of gratitude for the tenacity of the two women on this call and all of the people who have been mobilizing for decades in this country to have the contributions of Black people in Canada to be recognized. I think that it is crucial to name very, very clearly that Black philanthropy, and that's the domain that I work in, is alive and well in every generation. And that willingness to pick up the phone, to knock on a door, to walk, to print the paper, to write the letter, it is continual, it is consistent. And it is because of that unrelenting will and desire to see better for our people in Canada that we have the successes and we have the legacy of 25 years of Black History Month in Canada. And we can be here now. And I have the benefit of standing on the shoulders of giants like these two incredible women. And we're on a trajectory, right? Every seed that was planted in 1994 is blooming today. Every seed that was planted 400 years ago is blooming today. And that is what we really need to hold on to, is the magic. What does Black History Month mean to me now? And what did it mean to me then? What it meant to me then was that it was possible. It acknowledged the fact that me being Black in Canada was a real thing. And my existence was real and validated. What it means to be now is the inspiration that it comes from lives and breathes today, and it will live and breathe for the generations to come. And for that, I am personally grateful. And I know that many, many, many people of African descent are truly grateful.
Mm-hmm.
Beautifully said. And I'm sure you echo what a lot of folks of your generation and younger would say as well. Because whenever I said to people, oh, I'm going to be speaking to Jane Augustine and Rosemary Sadlier, they were always the giants, like the icons. So,
I'm only 4'5".
But there's certainly, you've made your mark in very, very important ways. Is there any particular event or person in Black Canadian history you wish more people knew about? And I know, Rosemary, you did mention a couple of individuals from your work and research, but if anyone wants to mention, or Rosemary, you can add more, but I'm just wondering if there's anyone who wants to say something in particular that we really should be learning more about and understanding more than we do today.
Well, I think there are important people within our recent history, as it were, that young people should know about. They should know about someone, as an example, called Wilson Brooks. And he was Black Canadian, military, come back, went into education, and was, I think, the first Black school principal in the Toronto District School Board. I think it's important for us to recognize people who've paved the way and people who have somehow made it so that the generalization that we can't do it because. We also need to see our history in a more national sense, pan-Canadian, as it were. That there were people from out west who've made their mark, like Rosemary Brown, who started as the first African woman, who in Vancouver, in British Columbia, and her struggles. There's a book out there, Being Brown, which gives a really good history about her involvement in politics and what it was like for a Black woman entering politics. And at the same time, when the notion of women as caregivers and look after the husband and the children, and then you're out there in politics, the reputational kind of issues. I think it's also important for us to know about, we mentioned Stan Grizel in passing a little while ago, and the railroad workers, those people who worked on the train, and the importance to the families in Montreal and to the sustenance of so much in the society. These men were able to, we also need to know about someone, I'm going very quickly, Wilson Head, Dr. Wilson Head, an American who had several difficulties in the South, American South, moved to Canada and has made his mark as someone who was not only an educator, a professor, a researcher, but at the same time laid the foundation for us in terms of organization building, like the Canadian Canadian Alliance on Race Relations. So there are so many people out there, and I think that young people, once they start to do the research, they'll find a number of those names keep cropping up. That at every one of our universities now, we have professors who have, who've done some of that work that they could. At York University, we have any number of professors there. And at the same time, it's important as we look at the lives of those people and we look at the tracks that they've set down and the difficulties that they encounter, we realize how much more we ought to do. And the more we put out there, that would come up as first when you go straight into your Wikipedia or you go straight into your whatever else. Because the problem that I see is when someone goes in, the first thing that crops up is the American situation.
No question, that happens quite a bit. So no, thank you for that. Is there anyone else that are you good with that? Or you wanted to say anything else? Did I cut you off? Is that okay?
No, well, that's okay. I mean, I can look at more recent people like, Dr. Gervin Ferran, who's been the first president of a Black president of a university, wide experience in different thing from the West. He was out West. He was in Southern Ontario. He's now in Toronto. So there are role models out there.
Yeah.
And those role models, we have them in the field of science. We have them in STEM programs, in engineering, in medicine. Again, long list of people. There was a time when you called educators together, you couldn't fill a phone booth. Now you have all these principals and vice principals and superintendents and supervisory officers and whatnot, all people who are of African Canadians. So we just have to do the searching, and we just have to continue to do the work.
And speak more about these people and
Right.
get it more out there, right?
Yeah.
Anyone else would like to add a few names?
Well, there's so many names, and I think that when you start getting into listing names, there's always someone you leave out. But what I will maybe make a particular mention of is that we have coming up very soon a national apology that will be issued to the descendants, essentially, but to honor the number 2 Construction Battalion. And I think that it's very important because I grew up really having a very, Toronto isn't a military town. You don't feel the military presence like you might in Halifax, where you see the Navy, you can't miss it. In Toronto, it's very easy to not see. And aside from a plaque that existed at my church that honored veterans of the World War II, I didn't really see a connection or understand a connection of Black people in this country defending this country. And this is not because I'm a warmonger, but it is because I'm a freedom lover. I think that it's very critical for us to be mindful of the reality that Black people have been defending this country since before 1867. And the number 2 Construction Battalion is among those who defended this country, whose work was never adequately, properly, or respectfully acknowledged, and it is about to be. I'm really proud to say that about 70% of the recruits from New Brunswick were related to me on my father's side, and at least one person on my mother's side was also a recruit, because they drew from across Canada, but they trained in Nova Scotia. So I think that it's individuals, but it's also the reality that, as Jean alluded, we have contributed in every field. We are not just in sports. We are not just in social activism. We are in everything, and we live everywhere, and we have done so for a long time.
Good points. Very, very good points. Rebecca, what would you like to add to that?
I'd like to just amplify and say that the call to action is to dig into your areas of interest, whether it is science or the arts, literature, politics, any domain that you find yourself genuinely interested in. You will find, as Rosemary has said, you will find contributions of Black Canadians in those spaces. And that is the opportunity to embed Black history into all aspects of your life, all aspects of your research, all times of the year. So those stories are there. And there's living legends around you as well. And one thing that is not often named is that there are many, many, many people who contribute tremendously to their communities, who may not have the title, who may not have the CEO or the principal or the XYZ title. There are aunties and elders and community members, young activists who may not be in the newspaper, but they are history makers and they are living legends today. And so I encourage you to reach out to people that you may not know and ask questions, be curious, and use that as an opportunity to discover history making that's happening in this moment.
I think also I'd like to mention the fact that we have a program, and I'm co-author of that, 100 Accomplished Black Canadian Women. And we have a database of these. We're in the 3rd edition now. And so we have 300 women who've been cited and acknowledged as accomplished Black Canadian women. And we have a database of others. And so again, that encouragement to go to that database or to seek out the 100 ABC women and see the span of expertise and the career and different aspects, as you say, Jennifer, Rebecca, the lives of many of those women and never splashed across your Globe and Mail or your Toronto Star, but they're out there quietly. I think COVID also showed us who were the essential workers and the caregivers and those people in the front line. And so those are the stalwarts of our community, making a difference day after day after day to Canadian society. And I'm glad we're at a place where where the conversations now are around the contributions of those individuals.
Looking back over the years and seeing where we are today, what gives you hope for the future in terms of, the young Black Canadians and, they're sort of their ability to stand up for themselves, advocate for themselves in a way, and just to bring it back to the whole context of Viola Desmond, what gives you hope that they have maybe greater tools in their toolbox to advocate effectively, sort of the way both you, Jean, and Rosemary were able to do in the past?
Well, I think, we skirted around it, but the times are different. Yeah. And the times are different for a number of reasons. The times are different because we have a larger and even more diverse African Canadian community who have come with expectations of freedom and inclusion and involvement and engagement, perhaps from the countries that they arrived from. Things are different because we have George Floyd, and his murder was not just an American call to action. It was a global call to action because we were all equitably in a position to view, consider, and reflect on what that meant. The pandemic required us to be home, and George Floyd required us to be at home with our conscience. And I think that has put a lot of people, because people don't just start finding the opportunity to be advocates. People are always advocates, but their advocacy is thwarted, it's undermined, it's dismissed, it's people are ignored pointedly. Now it's harder to do that because the numbers are different and because the awareness is greater. People can no longer in Canada neatly say, well, that just happens there.
Right.
When people are now saying and demanding in greater number that it happens here too. So I think that it's a climate. It's in addition to people maybe positioning themselves a little bit differently, and it's also how we can communicate. How much more effective and quick is it to send out an email blast, a tweet, compared to what I was doing when I first started trying to carry on the mandate of the organization I represented. We had a dial phone, and I think faxes were the newest technological advance. I remember getting a computer in the office. It was like, these were brand new things. So prior to that, it was phone calls, actual in-person meetings in offices. That's a very slow process. Organizing an event was very different. Now, one tweet and you might have something happening in a day. So it's just technology, reflection, and conscience coming together at one point.
Thank you. Jean, did you have anything you wanted to say on that?
No, I think that that things are spinning fast. The word I think they're using right now is the word pivot. that we pivot in all directions simply because we were able to do this. I think that when I was growing up in Happy Hill, St. George's, Grenada, I used to hear the term global village, village. And the concept of global village was made really, really very clear to me during the pandemic. Because what happened here happened there. What affected them affected us. And the whole issue, and this is where the George Floyd and social justice and the justice system and what's happening to people, the anti-Black racism and all of this come together simply because we are in this global village. The issue of the vaccines, who gets it, who shares it, who has the ability to manufacture it, you know, the global village and the response. And then if we go back a couple of weeks, the whole discussion around the COP26, the issue of climate and climate change and how that's affecting, you know, the small nations, the small countries, those that are below sea level. And what is happening right here in Canada that's affecting us all. And so again, the notion of the global village, that we're all in this together. And as the old saying would say, we either all float together or we all sink together. And I think we're beginning to realize that. And a lot of that discussion took place at that climate conference. We're all in this.
All in this together. Yes, absolutely. Rebecca, I know, Jean, you have to get off in a second, but Rebecca, did you want to say anything with regards to this question and how to advocate? What advice would you give for these?
I think it's the same thing that it inspires me about young activists, as well as the call to action is dual. It is around that collective healing that needs to take place with the multiple levels of trauma that we are experiencing and have experienced. So one of the calls to action is radical rest and taking time for yourself. Self-care and is also communal care. So being able to just really take the time that we need. In the global pandemic, we've all been put on pause and have had to really self-reflect. And I think it's a very powerful opportunity for healing. And then the other thing that is inspiring and motivates me is a real call to action around Black excellence and Black joy and Black happiness. And so much of our storytelling comes from the trauma that we've experienced as people, as enslaved people, and the resistance that happened. In those moments of resistance, there is also tremendous, tremendous joy. And I would love to hear more of those stories. I love to hear those stories. And I, am excited about that. That's what excites me. That's what continues to keep me going is Black joy and what they call, in many cases, Black girl magic and Black boy magic. And Black people are incredible. So let's see it, more of it.
That's beautiful. That's really well said and very profound. Thank you for that. Wondering if anyone does want to talk about the greatest challenges facing African Canadians today.
It seems to me the whole discussion centered around challenges, the challenges challenges around getting our history out, ensuring that society recognizes our place, that we are, in the contributions we are making to Canadian society, that it's important for our young people to learn about their heritage so that they can stand equally in Canadian society. I think we also mentioned that some of the anti-Black racism, the things within either the justice system or the education system that we have to amend, the support that we need to give to ensure that that we find ourselves in every part of the society, not just in the margins, but that we find ourselves in the center of activities, and that corporate bodies and institutions and others must support this kind of main line or main road that should lead to the promotional opportunities and the ability for us to be in the places to give voice to those concerns. And again, I think we underscore the whole business of diversity and inclusion and the importance of that, because we were where we were simply because the knowledge and the importance of that knowledge was not kind of communicated in the way it should, so that we were empowered by the society.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to take a stab at that question? It's something important that you feel like we didn't address at this point in terms of what needs to happen, what we have to tackle.
It's a long question.
It is.
It's really a challenging question, and I think it's just really very important for us. I mean, as much as I appreciate that we'd like to keep it a bit positive, I think that we have to be reminded that that there are challenges that remain, that even though there's a reason that there is activism, there's a reason that there's been ongoing activism, that because things don't get solved and then stay that way. Even if one thing is nuanced and addressed, there's always some element of inequality or where somebody is left out, where somebody's voice is not heard, generation after generation. And sometimes it's fairly overt and it's easy to see, but sometimes it's less easy to see. And I think that we have to be mindful not only of overarching systems and systemic racism, but also the unconscious bias that we all experience, also the microaggressions that have clearly impacted some very high profile people that we can think of in recent days. And be mindful that even though we might see a number of people of African origin succeeding and getting those positions or in a couple of fields, that for the vast majority of people of African origin, those opportunities are just not there. And they are faced with issues in hiring and other areas. So there are lots of things that we have to keep active and keep addressing because they just don't disappear.
I think that recognizing the challenges that we face, that there is a multifaceted approach to tackling systemic anti-Black racism. And so all of the tools are effective tools. There are going to be people who are working inside of institutions and are changing policy inside institutions and vocalizing, standing up and speaking inside the institution. There'll be people outside of the institution in the streets, really, really shaking things up, being provocative, and both are necessary for collective action and collective change. And I say both, but I really mean to say all. So all tools are at our disposal. And it really takes a moment of self-reflection to understand your position, the people that you have in your networks, the access that you may have. How can you open doors? How can you implement change? How can you shift the needle a little bit? And know that there are other people in other industries and other institutions also shifting and changing. So it takes all of us, it takes collective power. And back to the beginning of our conversation, like collective courage to really stand up and know that there may be repercussions for your willingness to step forward. You may face challenge, but there's a community and a movement all happening together. That's what's powerful. And I think we really need to remember that, because the challenging times are very, very, very dire. And when we do it together, we have momentum and possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. You worked really hard to get the passing of the Emancipation Day, commemoration of that day. What does that mean to you? And how does that sort of, maybe let's sum up the conversation with perhaps that as how, that was a very recent thing, and how that kind of brings us full circle in a sense to where we're sitting today.
Yeah, the process of having Emancipation Day proclaimed began about 1995 for me. This doesn't mean, but of course it builds upon many celebrations that had been taking place, but no one had opted to secure official recognition for it. And part of the reason for doing so was the process that had begun in terms of Black History Month and what that meant. And also another part was that I was approached by a colleague from Trinidad and Tobago about doing this in Canada. And it was meaningful because it is a way, even though Black History Month is a way to talk about all aspects of the Black experience and Black history. I think that Emancipation Day, it gives a specific focus to the reality that Canada had a 200-year history of enslavement of Africans and First Nations people as well, more of Africans. And this is something that is so beneath the understanding and the awareness of so many people that it's another way of being able to, in a moment, bring time and attention to that particular discussion and that particular idea. And to look at the connections and to look at the impact of what those 200 years of slavery in this country have on people right now, because the view of what a Black person is, the ideas about what a Black person is capable of, the ideas about what a Black person does, or their lack of knowing, or their ways of behaving, were all determined and identified and continued through markers that were created during that time. So ideally, when we are now finally, after many, many iterations, because it went to second reading twice in the House, it went to second reading twice in the Senate, second reading twice in the House, like over almost 15 years ago, and then second reading in the House, in the Senate, and finally, ultimately, to have it passed unanimously in March of 2021. It was incredibly powerful because of not just the fact that I had been working on it since 1995, but because what it means is that we all now have this other moment, this other day, to bring focus and attention on the reality that yes, we are in this country, but yes, we are in this country having also given our blood, sweat, and tears through the enslavement of our ancestors. and what that has meant for our experience now and the harms that it has caused over generations. So it's important because it's another way of bringing time, focus, and attention to the long-term presence of people of African descent in this country and their long fight for freedom that didn't quite get fully realized on August 1st, 1834.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Any other comments that any of you want to say before you all jump off? Yes, please, Rebecca.
Specifically on Emancipation Day. I grew up spending I grew up spending many summers in Guyana with my grandmother and my great-grandmother. And my great-grandmother lives in West Coast Berbice, and Emancipation Day is celebrated, we call it Soiree, and it happens to fall in the summertime. And I have spent many, many summers with my family celebrating Emancipation Day. I'm almost moved to tears. It is such a powerful time of pride and honoring our ancestors who were enslaved. And the town that we celebrate in is called Hope Town. And Hope Town, it just speaks to the hope of my ancestors for that freedom and for that desire to be seen as full people. Mm-hmm. And for me, to be able to celebrate Emancipation Day as a Canadian in Canada, it is so powerful. It is so powerful. It speaks to that global village. We have a global history of colonization, and that also manifests in Canada. And so I am deeply proud to know that August 1st is Emancipation Day in Canada. Mm-hmm. So thank you for that effort. Mm-hmm. Thank you for doing that work for 25 plus years. It means so much to me and so much to my family.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to thank you all so much for taking the time. I know we went over the time that we originally allotted, but it was such a profound and stirring conversation. And I thank you again for taking the time to speak with me.